I'm here with Professor Yuval Noah Harari to talk about his new book, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. This interview will be screened at the Kerala Literature Festival 2019 in Calicut on January 10 to 13. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
I'm just going to start with, I want to ask you about the rationale behind you writing each book.
Mm-hmm.
With Sapiens, you tried to tell us a little the narrative of the past of Homo sapiens. With Homo Deus, you tried to explain a little bit the possibilities of humans in the future. And with the 21st century, with the 21 Lessons for 21st Century, you're trying to narrow it down to the immediate present.
Yes.
And the possible future that we'll have, where we are transitioning into a major paradigm with technology becoming a major driving factor. Now, what were your rationale writing the first two? Because it seems like the first two books you wrote and the third one, the 21 Lessons, seemed to be part of a series. Was that intended?
No, it was never intended. It just came out kind of organically. I'm an historian, so Sapiens was like my attempt as a historian to tell the story of the human past, how we were transformed from insignificant apes in Africa into the rulers of planet Earth. And this was the story of Sapiens. And I had no intention of writing anything else. But after Sapiens came out, I got more and more questions about the future, because most people are more interested in the future than in the past. So in many interviews, I would be asked, okay, so with everything you know about the past, what can you tell us about what will happen next? So my mind turned more and more towards the future. And this is how Homo Deus was written. And then in Homo Deus, I talked about the long-distant future, the long-distant trends that dominate history. But you cannot live in the distant future and you cannot live in the past, you live in the present. And eventually, whatever insights you have about the past or the future must manifest themselves in how you live in the present, how you deal with your personal issues, how you deal with the immediate political problems of the world. So this led me to write 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. It's taking the long-term perspective of the first two books and using it to look from a new perspective on the immediate problems of the present, whether it's immigration, or whether it's populism, or terrorism, or the economic crisis, or inequality, and all these issues.
Well, diving right into the start of the book, you mentioned that there's a certain disillusionment with the liberal story,
Mm-hmm.
and that historically, when you go right past with World War II, the idea of fascism went down, but then you had the Russian ideology of a communist future and a liberal story. And subsequently, the liberal story kind of outlived the other one. Coming into the modern day, you say that the liberal story is facing a major crisis.
Yes.
Partly due to rise in technology, partly due to the fact that the liberal story can be hacked by populist movements as well. Where do you see that story evolve? I mean, is there a hope for that liberal story? What do you see politically and culturally happening to the liberal narrative?
Well, it can revive itself. Liberalism have went through several cycles of crisis and regeneration during the last century. The two most important crises was in the 1930s with the rise of fascism. That again, for a while, it seems that liberalism is completely gone, is completely collapsed. And only thing that remains is the fight between fascism and communism. But liberalism managed to get through the fascist crisis. And then we had this conflict between liberalism and communism. And again, there was a big crisis for liberalism in the 1960s and 70s. And where, communist movements all over the world gained strength, liberalism was more and more confined to a few countries, mainly in Western Europe and North America. And even there was a lot of social unrest, the entire period around 1968, with the riots in Europe and in the United States and so forth. And many people thought that this is the end of liberalism. And it again managed to reinvent itself and revive. And actually communism was the story that collapsed. And liberalism spread all over the world. So there is a good chance that this time too, liberalism will be able to reinvent itself and to revive itself. And the great advantage of liberalism over all other ideologies is that it is the most flexible ideology. It is the most open to criticism. It is actually the only ideology that even allows and encourages you to question its own foundations. And this has been the secret of the ability of liberalism to reinvent itself, because it can adapt to different conditions and absorb new ideas from the criticism it receives. So maybe it can do it again. We don't know. Nobody knows, of course, what the current political crisis will lead to. And we don't even understand the roots of the current political crisis. Because, from a long-term perspective, the liberal world of the last 20 or 30 years has been the best time in history. Violence has gone down to the lowest level in history in the last 30 years. The incidence of famine and of plague is lower than in any previous time in history. Yes, there are many problems still, but I'm not saying that everything is perfect. I'm just saying it's better than it ever was. If people think that things are bad now, I would like to know, when was it ever better? Which year in history was better for humans than in the early 21st century? So this is why it's a bit strange that we now have this crisis of confidence, that people are losing faith all over the world. Even in the core liberal democracies of the West, people are losing faith in the liberal story. Again, one common answer that this is the result of growing inequality and the decline of the welfare state. So the working class and the poorer people are very angry about it. But it doesn't really sit well with the facts. Because, for instance, in the United States, in 2016, if people were really upset about inequality and the decline of the welfare state, they should have voted for the Democrats, not for a billionaire who doesn't pay his taxes and who is in favor of continuing to reduce taxes on the rich and the big corporations and dismantling what is left of the American welfare state. So this can't really be the answer. Another potential answer for what is happening is that we have a crisis not just of economic inequality, we have a crisis of dignity and of meaning, that a lot of people are feeling that they are losing their dignity and really the meaning of their lives, their potential contribution to the future. In the 20th century, even when things were bad, everybody, the communists, the fascists, the liberals, everybody told ordinary people that you are the future. Like if you lived in the Soviet Union, so all the posters on the wall, they showed you common people, workers, peasants in heroic poses. And it was very clear, you are the future. You are building the future of humanity. Now, things may be much better than in the Soviet Union. But when ordinary people look not at the posters on the wall, but they watch YouTube or they watch television, or they don't see themselves. Because the future now belongs to a very small elite which dominates the major developments of our age. If you listen to all the talks and all the scientists, so they don't talk about the common person. They talk about artificial intelligence, bioengineering, robotics, machine learning. This is making the future. And the ordinary person has no role to play in this development, in this future. So I think the greatest fear of humans is to become useless, to become irrelevant. In the 20th century, the big struggle was against exploitation. I don't want to be exploited, so I vote for the communists. Now,
the biggest danger is not exploitation, it's irrelevance. I'm afraid that I am becoming irrelevant and useless. And this is driving a lot, I think, of the populist anger we see.
Now, how does technology factor into creating this kind of crisis? Because you did mention that the elitist group, it seems like they're defined by their dominance over technology.
Yes.
Or it's not just about wealth. And if that is the case, such a future will undermine, the concept, the fiction that you say in *Sapiens* of what a nation is.
Yeah.
Because when you have large-scale unemployment, that fiction will not be enough to kind of sustain national integrity. So I guess the first question is, how do you define that elitist group? Are they, in the future, going to run the world in terms of undermining the so-called powerful nations that exist? And is there a certain resilience that the general people who you say will feel like they're irrelevant? Is there a way they can have a certain resilient movement to kind of overcome this, or is there
Yeah, I mean, there are difficult issues. I mean, again, in the 20th century, to build a powerful nation, you needed everybody. You needed, because of the conditions of industrial economies and industrial warfare, if a country wanted to be a powerful nation, it needed millions of soldiers in the army, it needed millions of workers in the factories, in the offices, in the schools. So the whole national ideology was about mass mobilization. And this also meant that almost everybody felt important and useful because everybody was useful. But now the new developments in the economy, also in the army, focus more and more on cutting edge technology, which outperforms humans in more and more tasks and makes or will make more and more human irrelevant and useless. That AI is replacing humans in more and more fields, and you still need humans to design the AI, but not a lot of humans. You need a small elite of highly professional, highly skilled humans, whereas larger and larger segments of the population are becoming both economically and even militarily less and less important. So everything we knew from the age of the masses, from the 19th and 20th century, in which power relied on the masses, this is not eternal. This is changing. We are now exiting the age of the masses. And it's not easy for ordinary people to join. The new elite, it's not necessarily evil. It's not trying to destroy everybody else. And there is a lot of criticism of elitism, but in the end, in many cases, we want elites. If you go to if you're sick and you go to the hospital, you want to have an elite doctor who is very professional. And you don't want this to have a vote between all the people in the hospital, what should be done. No, you want an elite professional. If you go on an airplane, you want an elite pilot to fly the airplane. So there is nothing wrong in essence with having a professional elite. The problem is what happens if the professional elite no longer needs the masses of the people. So a few people who have the right education, they have the skills, they can join, but most people will be left behind. And we don't have a social and political system which is adapted to these conditions. We might see growing inequality both within countries and between countries. Between countries, what might happen is that the new revolutions in AI and biotechnology and so forth will be dominated by a few leading superpowers. Everybody else will be left behind. A bit like happened in the 19th century with the Industrial Revolution, that Britain and France and Japan and the United States, they led the revolution and they dominated the whole world, and most countries were left far behind. This can happen again with the AI revolution. And this time it can also lead to inequality within societies when you have a small elite that dominates all the new technologies and the wealth and power they generate, and the masses of the population that lose their economic and political power. And unless we find a solution to this imbalance, to this growing inequality, there will be huge political and cultural difficulties. And the current wave of populism doesn't offer any real answers. I mean, it feeds from the feelings of fear and anger that people have, but they don't have answers. Most of the new populist leaders, they don't have any vision for the future. And they even don't talk about these issues, like the rise of artificial intelligence and what it will do to the job market. What they mostly offer people is nostalgic fantasies about the past. They turn to religious and nationalist mythology to try and give people meaning. I mean, the attractiveness of religion and nationalism today is that it tells people, you are not meaningless, you are not useless, you are not irrelevant, you are the most important thing in the world. This is what religion and nationalism tell people. And this is very attractive. But this is not a solution. It's a very, it's a nice fiction that can get a leader elected to power, but it doesn't solve the technological and economic crisis that we are facing.
Now, when you talked about possible solutions to mitigate some of this in the feeling of being irrelevant in the future, I think it partly has to do with changing how we are educated. Mm-hmm. Given that automation will replace a lot of our repetitive tasks, and that we can have robots that can work much efficient than us, what kind of education should people in the future have that keeps them relevant, that makes them feel like they can actually do something that's part of the society that they live in the future?
Yeah, this is one of the biggest questions, is education and what skill to give people. I mean, while automation will eliminate many jobs, other jobs will appear. It's not the case that there will be no jobs at all. There will be jobs, but there will be jobs that will require maybe a lot of creativity and ingenuity and special abilities that computers still find it hard to compete with humans in these fields. And the question is whether people will be able to retrain themselves, because a lot of monotonous, simple jobs will disappear. There will be new jobs, but do people have the ability to retrain themselves? Now, the new jobs can be jobs like in designing computers and virtual reality games and things like that. They can also be service jobs. For instance, maybe you need a lot of yoga teachers, because you now have, you have all the computer engineers sitting all day just typing, coding computers, and they need to train themselves and exercise. They need yoga teachers. But let's say you're a truck driver and you lost your job to a self-driving vehicle. There are new jobs to be a software engineer or to be a yoga teacher. But it's not easy to turn a truck driver into a yoga teacher or into a software engineer. It takes time, it takes a lot of money. While you retrain yourself, it's also psychologically quite difficult. And the other problem is, it's very difficult to anticipate in advance what the new jobs will be and what kind of skills will be necessary. Nobody knows for sure how the job market would look like in 30 years. So we don't know what to teach kids today in school that will be relevant in 30 years. The best bet is to teach children mental flexibility, to give them the skill to continue learning and changing and reinventing themselves again and again throughout their lives. The most important skill will be the ability to keep learning and changing. And this is what we should be teaching, but this is very difficult to teach. You teach history, so in most cases, okay, so you learn all these dates and names and kings and battles. Or you teach physics, so you learn these equations. Or you even learn you teach computer coding, so you learn a particular skill. But this doesn't prepare your brain and your mind to remain flexible. How to train people to develop mental flexibility, this is very, very difficult. And this is the most important skill. If you have that, you will be able to adapt in the future as the economy and the job market keep changing. But if you don't have the mental flexibility, you just have a particular skill. When that skill is no longer needed because a computer can do it better, then you have nothing to do.
Let's for a second talk about the bubonic plague.
Mm-hmm.
In Homo Deus, you made a good example that 700 years ago, when plague struck widely across Europe, it was rational for them to believe that it was the work of a devil or a spirit that moved through you. Hundreds of years later, there's knowledge of bacteria and viruses, and now humans were able to aptly handle that scenario and kind of help humanity come out of plague or several diseases like that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it seemed rational 700 years ago to think that the devil actually walked amongst us.
Yeah.
Now that we have bacteria, it seemed like the devil is irrelevant.
Mm-hmm.
In that frame of mind, the question is religion rational? Are humans, in becoming more rational, will humans say finally that religion was the construct, the fiction that we needed at the time
Mm-hmm.
to kind of process our external world? And now that we know so much, we can switch out of it. And to further extrapolate that, is the notion or the concept of God rational?
Well, there are many different questions here. Religions, as far as scientists can tell, all religions are human creations. Humans invented various religions in order to organize themselves better, in order to organize society and the political system and justify the laws. I mean, if I come to you and I tell you must do this because I want you to do it, then you say, I don't agree. But if I tell you, no, God told me that you must do it, it's the greater chance that you will do it. So this is the scientific view of religion. It's human creation to enable human cooperation in society. And we see that all religions change through history, adapting to different conditions. And religious people usually think that no, religion stays the same. It's eternal truth. It doesn't change. But all the religions that we know about, Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity, they all changed through history. To give just one example, 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago, a central role of religion was to solve agricultural and medical problems. If you have drought, you pray to the gods. If there is disease, you go to the temple and you do some ceremony. And you think about the career of somebody like Jesus. Half the time he was a doctor. He was healing people. Now, religion no longer does it. Religious people even say, agriculture, medicine, what is that has to do with religion? Why? Because somebody else is doing it better. If there is a drought, you go to the engineers. If there is a plague, you go to the doctors. So religion had to change its story and its appeal. There will be still religions in the 21st century in order, again, to organize people, to explain what is your identity. It's very, so I don't think that religions will completely disappear. Some religions might actually fuse together with the new technologies to create what we can call techno-religions, religions based on technology. You can say that the first techno-religion was actually socialism or Marxism, because it made all the old religious promises. We'll have peace, prosperity, happiness, justice, everything that the old religions promised. But you don't have to wait until after you die, and then with the help of some god you will get it. No, with the help of technology, of industry, we can create paradise here on earth. And this failed. But we might see new techno-religions emerging in the 21st century, promising people not just justice and prosperity, even eternal life with the help of bioengineering and computer science. Now, with regard to God, the word God has two very, very different meanings that confuse people. One one God is kind of the enigma or the mystery of the universe. Like you ask yourself, how did the universe begin? And how did life begin? And who decided the laws of physics? Who decided that E equals mc squared and not something else? And you don't know the answers, and you say, this is God. This is a big mystery. We can't understand. And the chief characteristic of this God is that we don't know anything about him. We can't say anything about it. It's a mystery. Then there is a very different God. The other type of God, we know a lot of tiny details about. We know everything. This is the God of, that stands behind all the laws and rules of religious traditions. We know what he likes us to eat. We know what he thinks about sex. We know what he thinks about women. We know what he thinks about politics. So there are completely different gods. The gods we can't say anything about, the big mystery, and the gods we know in exact details what he wants us to eat for lunch. And I believe in the first God. Yes, there is a big mystery we don't understand. But the second God, this is human invention. And the trick that many religious people do is to confuse the two gods. When they ask you, how do you know that God exists? They will start talking about the mystery of the universe, of the Big Bang and the laws of physics and what we don't know. And then they somehow use this to justify all the rules and regulations, like we don't know how the Big Bang started, and this is why women should wear long clothes and not go naked. And this is why homosexuality is bad. But there is no connection between the two. But people use the same word God for both, and this is how they do this trick.
Just that, because you said that in the future, when humans require, may seem irrelevant, there is still the question that you talk about it in Sapiens about, how there is a certain happiness that people have when they try to do something meaningful.
Mm-hmm.
You say the scientist who wants to add to the store of value in humanity finds it meaningful, and they're just as delusional as that business guy that's doing the thing to make some change in society or become rich. Now, in the future that you kind of predict with 21 lessons, can sapiens, find something to do that makes their lives happy? Can, we still pursue meaning? Because
no, certainly. I mean, there are still, again, we don't know for certain what the impact of the new technologies will be, because technology is never deterministic. You can use the same technology to create completely different kinds of societies. In the 20th century, you could use the technology of the Industrial Revolution. Trains, electricity, radio, cars, all that. People used it to build communist dictatorships or fascist regimes or liberal democracies. It's the same technology, used in different ways. Similarly, when you look to the future, so we could use AI and bioengineering in very different ways. We can use this to create extreme totalitarian regimes in which a tiny elite controls all the power, all the wealth, dominates everybody else, and nobody can resist it because of its immense power. And we could use the same technology to create extremely egalitarian and free societies in which most of the work is being done by robots and computers and so forth, but then the benefits are spread between all the population, and people have more time to engage in art, in sports, in meditation, in religion if they want. And both scenarios are possible. The question is, what do we choose to do with the immense new powers of AI and biotechnology?
And you think there will still be meaning to our lives, even when all the necessary tasks we're rolling, the careers that we do?
Yeah, because you look at children don't work, and they seem to find a lot of meaning in playing, in what they do. In ancient times, hunter-gatherers, they did not work all the time. Today, in many societies, people think that meaning comes from your work. But this is not necessarily so, and many jobs are really not worth saving. Many jobs are very difficult, harmful to the body, boring to the mind. If you work in a factory all day, 10 hours a day, just making shirts, or if you work in a supermarket, just you're a cashier and people bring groceries and you just, this is not a very fun way to spend your life. It's necessary to keep yourself alive, but if you could keep yourself alive through some other means and spend your day, instead of being working in a factory, in say creating art or practicing meditation, it could be a much better life. Or building a good community with your friends and relatives, this can be much better.
So with that in mind, how do you define the spiritual process in human beings? You talk at length towards the end of your book about vipassana and the practices that you did.
Mm-hmm.
And you kind of suggest towards the end that humans should do more of that.
Yes.
Because although there might be a lot of science, there are not reliable tools that scientifically you can use to understand the mind.
Yes.
So how do you use that as a practice just for inner peace or something, or is that something you do to understand more about humanity?
Both. I practice vipassana meditation both for my inner peace and also for understanding the human mind better. Because I don't think there is any contradiction between meditation and science. They can be complementary. Science teaches us a lot of things about the brain, but it still has few good tools to research the mind. And the mind and the brain, they are related, but they are not the same thing. And if you want to explore the mind, the best thing to do is to observe the mind. In science, if you want to understand something, you have to explore it, to observe it. So how do you observe the mind? You can't observe the mind of somebody else. You can observe the brain of somebody else in a microscope of something, but that's not the mind. At least today, the only mind you can observe directly is your own mind with meditation. So if you want to understand the mind, I think meditation is one of our best scientific tools.
So let me wrap this up by asking you one simple fundamental question. What does it mean to be human today, and how would that definition change in the future?
Oh, what does it mean to be human today? It means to have, not as an individual human, but if you think about humanity as a whole, it means to have divine powers of creation and destruction without knowing what to do with them. Humanity now gains the power for the first time in history to actually create and redesign life, but we have very little idea what to do with this. Mm-hmm. So I would say that to be a human today is to be an irresponsible God. Somebody who has the divine powers of creation, but doesn't have the responsibility and the knowledge of what to do with it.
Okay, I think